deciding at what point Game of Thrones got bad is more of a subjective question than it first appears. It really depends on the person you ask and what they like from their entertainment. I also feel how much of a fan of George R. R. Martin's books you are also heavily factors into what you think of the show after about season 4. Throughout its run, you cannot argue that Game of Thrones became an entertainment juggernaut bigger than anyone in the production of the show could have ever dreamed of. In its wake came network after network looking to replicate HBO's success with their own Game of Thrones spin-off. You could not escape the show. So it's remarkably shocking that in the wake of season 8 of the show, how quickly it fell out of mainstream culture, with it largely being looked back on with disappointment and disdain by most. While universally people generally agreed that season 8 of the show is awful in large part to a lackluster long night, a poorly executed ending, and frankly some abysmal writing, that is not really where the rot began. But trying to figure out where that drastic decline began that people don't agree on, and from looking across the internet, the reasonings fit several schools of thought. The common answer as to when Game of Thrones got bad is season 5. For many, that is where the decline of Game of Thrones began, and in all honesty, it's a fair point. I remember watching season 5 live and was bitterly disappointed at how the whole Dawn plotline was handled. It's not only drastically different from the book, what they did to it was some of the worst writing the show produced. Doran Martell was a shadow of his book self, and I can't think of a single redeeming quality of how the Sand Snakes were handled. It may have resulted in a better season if they had just cut the whole Dawn plotline from the show altogether, rather than producing the shallow mess they did. We also have the character assassination of Stannis Baratheon. Could I see a situation where Shireen gets burned in the books? Yes, but definitely not in the fashion of the show. The less we say of Sansa's arc, the better. I simply cannot fathom why the showrunners thought it would be a good idea to give Sansa Jane Paul's plotline. It's not just a massive departure from the book in terms of plotline, but also it damages the whole character of Sansa. I know many casual fans who began to lose their passion for the show after her marriage to Ramsay and the certain graphic and distressing events that followed, which I cannot directly mention thanks to YouTube's strict community guidelines. And all of this is just scratching the surface. Characters were mostly not acting in character anymore. Dialogue had begun to sound wooden and very cringy, and the general plotting of the show and their choices to deviate from the book so drastically was becoming more obvious. There were still some good points, Hardhome for example, but there is just too many issues with the season for things to be redeemable. While I do agree that season 5 is where the wheels really did start to fall off the show, I do think if you take off the rose-tinted glasses and objectively look at season 1 to 4, there are some warning signs there. Namely, whenever the showrunners diverted from the book, what they did instead was always a bit lackluster, and the show worse off as a result. Dialogue at some times was also a bit questionable. However, this was masked somewhat by the showrunners in some cases directly taking lines from the books. What is frustrating is we know the showrunners were capable of standing on their own feet when going off book, as the scenes they added in the first season were generally well written and good additions to the show. However, as each season passed, their own ideas and writing got increasingly worse. But my point is, it can be argued that there are some aspects, especially in season 4, that were early warning signs to the decline to come. I'm very much a believer of the theory that all the showrunners were interested in doing was adapting the Red Wedding, that after they had adapted that moment, they just started to lose interest in making the show and had no true love for the story they were telling. I also think they started to believe their own hype, thanks to the success of the show, believing that they were the reason for its success. So why did season 5 get so much worse than season 1 to 4? For me, at least, the biggest reason was the fact they covered at least 3 seasons worth of book content in one single season. Between A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons, when you merge both books together, given they did The Storm of Swords in 2 seasons, I think we would have more than enough content to cover those 2 books in 3 seasons. I remember as news and casting came out and there was speculation they were going to rush through books 4 and 5, but I genuinely was shocked and disappointed when watching season 5 how fast they moved through the book material. What is frustrating is they achieved this by basically cutting seasons worth of storylines and content. This all resulted in a situation where in season 6 the show had past books and needed now to stand on its own 2 feet, with only George R. Martin's notes as guidance. And the writers had proven by this point they did not have what it takes to be able to do this effectively. If they had adapted books 4 and 5 with the care they had with the first 3 books, I think they would have found themselves in a much more favourable situation when trying to finish up the story on their own. It's bitterly disappointing we never got to see a proper adaptation of Feast and Dance on screen. Here is the issue with the quality drop of the show during Season 5 and into Season 6. Most of the fans who seemed to be unhappy with the quality of the show at this point tended to be fans of the book, who are aware of the way the story was being butchered and could see the signs of the disaster that was coming. During Season 5 and 6, thanks to some really well done high points, such as Hardhome and the Battle of the Bastards, for the more casual viewers, the issues with the show were kind of masked and not so obvious. However, there were some casual fans who were starting to see the cracks. The handling of the Sansa situation that I cannot mention in Season 5 did upset a lot of the more casual viewers, to the point even mainstream media was reporting on it. Into Season 6, 2 events really have all the hallmarks of the show starting to jump the shark for a lot of casual fans. First, we have Arya turning into the Terminator after being stabbed in the belly by the waif, and then Sansa's actions before the Battle of the Bastards in not telling Jon about the Vale army that was on the way. Both of these moments have been discussed to death in more casual online circles, and even get brought up today when discussing the question of the quality of the show. Season 7 follows the same pattern as Season 5 and 6. However, with the story really going off on its own direction by this point. But it was plagued with the same incompetent writing, with characters acting not like themselves. For me, the 2 biggest things off the top of my head would be the baffling idea of the trip beyond the wall to capture a right to take to King's Landing. So much is wrong with the entire concept, and by this point the idea of characters having jetpacks to get around so quickly is also in full effect. The needless drama between Sansa and Arya was also really bizarre choice the showrunners made, especially when it came to Littlefinger's plot. At this point, half of the cast of characters were shadows of who they were meant to be. While I know a lot of book fans were checked out in terms of the quality of the show by this point, as ratings of the show can tell us, the same cannot be said in terms of the mass audience. I think there may have been 2 reasons for this. As much as we like to be negative about the later seasons of Game of Thrones, there are still a lot of good things they did do. There were still some high points and cool moments. It was still a physically well-made and impressive-looking TV show, even if the writing was well below par. For me, the driving focus that kept me watching this show was to find out how the cliffhangers at the end of A Dance with Dragons resolve, and the idea that the ending of the show might in fact be the only ending to the story we get if George R. Martin does not finish the books. Even though I really did not like what was happening to the show, moments such as seeing the Tower of Joy in Season 6 and finding out the truth about Jon's birth was enough to keep me hanging on. And this is where we get to Season 8 of the show, which was like watching a car crash happen in slow motion. The problem is this time for the showrunners, they didn't have the shield of future seasons to hide behind anymore. They now had to wrap up the story and land the ending. How they handled this last season would define how the show and the showrunners themselves would be remembered. Needless to say, they missed the mark by a mile. The hype and promise of 7 seasons of build-up to the long night was squandered and frankly was underwhelming, and the rushed and messy way the ending of the show was handled, with Daenerys' turn to madness, and of course the idea of who has a better story than Bran the Broken. This time there was no hiding. The show had lost the support of both the casual and hardcore audience. Just to clarify, I don't have an issue with the ending per se. The wider concepts do kind of fit the kind of thing I could see George doing in the books. However, the way in which the show chose to approach the ending in terms of the story beats and lack of proper setup leads to a rush mess, which is inherently where the problem lies. Season 8 is the sum of years of neglect by the writers, and for 90% of the fanbase, when the show became obviously poor. But the show had some deep-rooted issues long before this, dating back into the first 4 seasons, with Season 5 really being the noticeable start of the decline, with each subsequent season adding more and more moments where the show kept jumping the shark. Every fan and every viewer has their own idea of when Game of Thrones did become bad. For me, signs were there in Season 4, and it became apparent in Season 5. But what I want to know is, when do you think Game of Thrones started to become bad, and why? It's a divisive topic, and I think it would be really cool to make a follow-up video to this, with your own views about the decline of the show, and see if we can build a better picture of the mood of the fanbase in this regard.